Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our meeting. I'm Jane James, President of the Canberra Jung Society. Thank you for joining us again here at the meeting. This evening, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Phenomenology. I'm sure it will be lots of Shauna, who will share with us an overview of her PhD research. This research is a philosophical team.
Well, thank you very much everyone for coming. I'm going to begin with a short 4-minute segment of our play. I wrote this play in 1997, but it's based on my first psychotic episode that happened in 1921 when I was 21. And the name of the play is Standoff's Moods, a guided tour through psychosis. Okay. How did they feel no city? Something important said to me. I knew that I was doing something very special. Not remember this. Ground starts to shift. I met a boy who I thought was a little. We went to a park together. He was sitting on his lap. I turned to him. Do you know who you are? Then the ground started to shake. The ground was shaking all over. Then when I took the corner, the ground would be still. Very still, you know, feeling right away. And I was smiling. There was something which has mind, but I must be very discreet. I always know what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a book. I'm looking for a book by a lecturer called Lyneham. I know there is something secret, something with the answers I need to know. He's my lecturer. He knows. Give me a help you. No, it's there. It's just something. And I'll put something. I played you. I'm wondering where Bill. This man. See the Bill. Oh, Jared! In the eye, chases after me, gives me something. Second. Oh, Jared! No, it's just to prove I'm okay. Just to prove that nobody is okay. I asked for the cinema. Gives me my cinema. What? Where the sun's earth? It's talking to me.
Okay.
I'm going to begin to biology, stolen very against reading Revelations. The construction of the soul was a Jasper, the street I know sitting around. But when the thoughts, it wouldn't have stand yet to be all guys, but I can study about this. And the Jasper, just the first stone, but the third time in the city, we're praying in the city, or in the car. 6 seconds, I was so quiet. Just survival story. It's a horrifying story.
Okay. Does that one have to be around so soon? Sorry. So my life's been a journey where I've tried to make sense of this episode and two others like it that I had in my 20s. And this journey has led me to the Australian National University, where I'm currently doing PhD. The title of my thesis is Consciousness and the Phenomenology of Psychosis. So I try to understand psychosis in a different way to the dominant biomedical model. The biomedical model tries to understand mental disorders in terms of imbalances in neurotransmitters, brain dysfunction, etc. I try to look at the way that consciousness varies in psychosis to see shed light on sort of experiences people have when they're psychotic. And I take the first person experience of psychosis seriously. So what we colloquially call madness refers to what I think can be very profound and fundamental human experiences. And if we want to understand disorders like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, then it's important to listen to the experiences of people who are being mad. But beyond this, a rich understanding of humanity requires that we listen carefully to what those who experience madness have to say. So my work involves a survey of 64 participants with experienced psychosis, as well as 16 one-hour interviews where I ask people to describe their psychotic experiences. And this talk is based on two of my research questions in my thesis and how the surveys and the interviews answer those two research questions. In my thesis, I actually have 3 research questions, and I have some results for the third question, but it's too much for one talk. As it is, I've got probably too much. And this talk is a work in progress, so I haven't written up my discussion sections, my chapters, and I'm still working on my arguments. So I just want to say that. And also, philosophers use a lot of jargon. And when I was writing this, I wanted to make it quite accessible, but it ended up getting quite dense in places. And I'm sorry about that. But what I'll do there is about 3 spots where I'll stop, where natural stops at the talk, and I'll open it up then to see if you want to ask some questions, just to see how we're travelling with it. Okay, so it might take a bit over an hour if you have those questions. But I'm just saying this is a philosophical talk, so I'm just warning you of that. Okay. So I'll start with some background information to situate my work, and then I'll go into these 2 research questions in detail. So my work is interdisciplinary. It sits within the framework of a few research areas. Firstly, it's part of a research program called Phenomenological Psychopathology. Now, phenomenology is a term that was first used to describe a research method used by a school of philosophy that included philosophers such as Husserl, but it's now used more broadly to mean the study of the structure of human consciousness. And consciousness, or our subjective experience, includes things like perception, sensations, emotions, etc. And philosophers often say there is something it's like it's things like to see the red of a rose, which smells like it. Psychopathology refers to the study of mental disorders, So phenomenological psychopathology refers to the study of the first experience of mental disorders such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, anxiety, depression, etc. Now, the philosophers who engage in this normally draw on the continental tradition of philosophy for their understanding of consciousness, such as philosophers like Husserl, etc. But I draw on the literature from the science of consciousness in the analytic tradition, specifically work from people like Kim Bain and Jakob Hooby. So Bain, Hooby and Owen argue against this idea that there are levels of consciousness. Now, clinicians working with brain damage patients often talk about different ways of being conscious in terms of levels. So if you're in a coma, you don't have any consciousness. If you're under light anaesthetic, you're at a higher level. If you're in a normal waking state, you're at a higher level. And if you're on amphetamines, you're at a higher level. And when you talk that way, simplistically, you're basically measuring consciousness along this one main dimension, and that's in terms of levels of arousal. Okay, but Bain and others say that these different ways of being conscious, such as the normal waking state, REM dreaming, being under light anaesthetic, being on LSD, they call these different ways of being conscious low states. And they say that they're distinguished from each other along multiple dimensions. Now, I call these dimensions domains, and they include level of arousal, but they also include the number and quality of contents, structure, which includes how we experience time, attention, unity in the self, and function, and that refers to how accessible the contents of consciousness are to systems in the brain like memory, decision making, etc. Now, in a moment, I'll go into these domains, or the ones I measure, in more detail. Okay. My work also engages with delusion literature, but I'm not going to go into that in this talk. It really refers to my third research question that I'm not going to discuss. But I will define psychosis and delusions to distinguish them. So psychosis refers to a disconnection from reality, and it includes experiences that may include hallucinations, delusions, disordered thoughts, etc. And it's a symptom of illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Delusions refer to unusual beliefs, often false beliefs, such as the belief some people have that they're dead, or that someone close to them has been replaced by an imposter. There are different theories of delusions. Again, I'm hoping to engage with this with my third research question, but I won't discuss it any further. Now I'll tell you what my three research questions are. The first one is, how does consciousness differ during psychosis compared to the normal waking state? And the second one is, do the general facts about consciousness during psychosis that we discuss in one mean that psychosis is a distinct global state? And the third one, which I won't discuss, is how are these general facts about consciousness during psychosis associated with the beliefs people have when psychotic and vice versa. Okay, so I'll start now for the next however long. I'll discuss my first research question, but I just want to pause here. As I said, I'll pause in a couple of places. Is that okay? Should I keep going? Does anyone have any questions? No. It's very good. Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, so my first research question has to do with the first part of my online survey. This survey was conducted with 64 participants who experienced psychosis. They were all over 18. They'd had at least one psychotic episode. They weren't currently in hospital. or experiencing significant distress or psychotic symptoms. So we sort of screened out people who were unwell. Now, this first part of the survey had 53 questions that measured 13 domains of consciousness, and I'll discuss these domains in a moment. And these questions were on a scale of 1 to 7, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, where 4 was equivalent to the normal waking state. I'll explain that a bit more. So these are the domains. I'll go into arousal in a bit more detail, and then I'll try and go through the others quickly. But with arousal, I mentioned clinicians working with brain damage patients, so patients in a coma or in a vegetative state. They use a taxonomy where they talk about different ways of being conscious in terms of levels. Now, there's no way we can objectively measure the level of consciousness in subjects. But there are a few measures that clinicians use. One's called the Perturbational Complexity Index, or the PCI, and this tells clinicians how much brain damage a patient has. And this is worked out by using electroencephalogram and transcranial magnetic stimulation. So transcranial magnetic stimulation is conducted with a patient, and it sends an echo across their brain, and this tells you how interconnected the brain areas are in terms of how they're communicating. So if someone's unconscious, that echo will die away very quickly. So an algorithm works out this PCI, which shows how brain damaged a patient is in terms of this interconnection. Another way that's used by neurosurgeons is called the Glasgow Coma Scale. And this really just reports how responsive patients are in terms of verbal commands and motor commands and how they do their lives. Now, in my survey, I tried to work out arousal with 4 questions, 2 for greater arousal and 2 for less aroused. So these questions were, during my last psychotic episode, I was more awake than normal, I was more alert than normal, my mind was working more slowly than normal, and I was less. And so what you have is, this is what the survey looked like. So people are answering strongly disagree to strongly agree, and the neither disagree or agree is going to be 4, which is going to be the normal waking state. Okay, so we do that for all 10 domains. I'll go through these others. I'll try to go more quickly, but why I'll go through them is to give you an idea how each of these domains can vary in different circumstances. So, you know, we should be able to hypothetically rate them because they change in. Okay, so the next one is number of contents. This is also called bandwidth. So we normally have a certain amount of information in working memory at a given time. So in the normal waking state, it's said we have about 4 chunks of information, but we can have more on LSD, less under light anaesthetic. The next 3 have to do with the quality of contents. So in terms of intensity, if I hear a bird outside, it's less intense than a car roaring past blaring music. With complexity, if I hear a single note of a piano, it's less complex than all the sounds in a nightclub. And with determinancy, if I see a rose at the centre of my visual field, it's more determinant than on the periphery where it becomes degraded. Next one is spread of attention. So the normal waking state can often have things that focus our attention, but it's being suggested on a drug like ketamine, your attention can be spread more broadly across the contents of consciousness. The next one is control attention. So if you're on ketamine or have an epileptic seizure, it's hard to control your attention, whereas normally you can. With time, in the normal waking state, we normally experience like a seizure, the present moment seems like a few seconds, but they can slow down if you walk, or speed up if you're engrossed in something, and then it can seem to stand still on LSD. I measure time in terms of whether the speed seems faster or slower, whether time seems different to the normal waking state. I also see if the sense of self seems different in psychosis. And these final three are to do with function, which I mentioned is how accessible these contents are to memory, decision-making and behaviour. Okay, I went into that in a bit of detail, but throughout the talk I'll be talking about these 13 domains and how they're rated. And so they're the domains that I measured in the survey. Okay. The way we did this, I had a lot of help with the statistics, and we used a program called SPSS. And the first thing we did was principal component analysis, which is a fancy way of getting the average. So you have 64 people answer 4 questions on arousal, you get the average. And say the average for arousal and psychosis is 5.19, whereas in a normal waking state it's 4. You want to know if there's a statistically significant difference between those two numbers or whether it's due to chance. And that's what a t-test does. So we ran t-tests on all these dimensions or domains to see, you know, which ones were significantly different during psychosis compared to the normal waking state before. Okay, the next slide is the results, so you can all get excited. Okay, so 10 out of 13 domains were significantly different during psychosis. And these include arousal, the number and quality of contents. Spread of attention wasn't different, but the control of attention was. The speed of time wasn't, but time didn't seem normal despite that. The experience of the self was different. Memory wasn't, but decision-making and behaviour were. So for this research question, how does consciousness during psychosis differ to the normal waking state? You have a hypothesis or alternative hypothesis that these 13 domains are not going to equal 4. And your answer is that consciousness differs during psychosis to the normal waking state along 10 of these 13 domains. So that's the survey answering my first research question. Okay. But I mentioned I also did interviews. And these interviews can shed a lot of light on these research questions as well. And these interviews were open-ended. They were just discussions with people to describe their experience, but I tried to ask a couple of targeted questions like, did you realise you're in a different reality when you're, you know, and was reality different because perception and sensation were heightened? I haven't finished analysing my interviews yet, but I'm including some quotes now, and I'll include some later in the talk as well, because I think quotes are very rich, you know, very rich. So I'll read some now. So when asking participants whether they recognise they're in a different reality or not, participant 4 said, I definitely knew it wasn't the normal reality that everyone else was living in. But when the ideas were coming, it felt like it was a revelation. That sense that things are starting to make sense and all this information is coming. Participant 5 said, it's like the inner world is bigger than the outside world. It's like you've gone within, you've gone somewhere else. But participant 5 also said that while reality seemed different, it wasn't just psychosis, it was also the treatment. They said, some of what I experienced was purely because I was in seclusion. I was in a locked ward. So when there's questions about time or familiarity or consciousness, that connection with things that are in the here and now, the context of when you're in a locked ward for 2 weeks has to be considered. A psychiatrist looks at you in the locked ward and says, yes, that's psychosis. But for me, some of what you're asking is actually the effects of treatment. If they're heavily sedating you, when I was answering your questions, some of that was because of heavy sedation. Some participants claimed they didn't realise reality was different. Participant 2 said, I slid into this world. Everything is suddenly focused on me. And it probably is that Truman Show idea, that overarching thing that's controlling everything in your life. It wasn't exactly my thoughts. It was more that external influence trying to control my thoughts. There wasn't a line in the sand where I could think, this isn't normal. I just slid into it thinking, oh, this is the new normal. Participant 3 suggested reality seemed more profound and eventful. They said, it was the everyday for me. Well, more profound and eventful. Could be alone in my flat for long periods of time. Feel like I was in company because I've been listening to the radio. The people on the radio were watching me through these cameras. What I was saying on the radio was in direct response to what I was doing in my flat and thinking. Because they were watching the show and they were commenting on it. So the whole profound and eventful thing, what I meant was, there's a sense of never being alone. There's always something going on. When in reality, I was just sitting in my flat listening to the radio for the better part of the day, alone. Again, I asked participants if reality seemed different because perception and sensation seemed heightened. Participant 1 agreed. They said, certainly, some of the things I'm aware of as my mood starts to escalate is that a lot of my senses become a lot more heightened. I exist in a state of heightened sensory perception anyway. I'm very sensitive to sound and to light, touch in particular. And as my mood goes up, that will shift from just being hypersensitive to these things to starting to perceive things that aren't there. Participant 2 denied that perception and sensation are heightened. They said, when you say heightened perceptions, I wouldn't say it was like a drug experience. I'd say I was more manic and I was definitely moodier, but I don't think I recognise this as being, oh wow, I can see things clearer. I didn't have any of that sort of thinking. Just the last one from now. I'll read some more quotes later. This is the last one now. Participant 4 said, I think everything's heightened. It just depends exactly what's going on. I think it's also motivation. I feel a lot more when I'm in a heightened mood. I'm so much more motivated to do things, and it's because I feel the sensation so much more. In terms of feeling the music when I'm dancing, I feel connected to music. There's something about being really in sync with it when I'm all heightened. It just feels like you're really bonded to the thing because it's not just your ears that are listening. Every bit of you is listening. Okay, so that's just a small selection of quotes. And as I said, I haven't finished analysing them all, but it gives you an idea of how these domains can be experienced differently. And I'll return to this later in the talk. I'll just take a break there. The next section is probably a bit denser when I start doing the second research question, but just did anyone have any questions? Sorry, I don't mean to ask. You're all okay with that? Okay, so we'll keep going. Okay. Well, this is the second research question, which is, do the general facts about consciousness during psychosis that we just discussed mean that psychosis is a distinct global state? Now, recall when a creature's conscious, they're conscious in a specific way, like the normal waking state, REM dreaming, being under light anaesthetic, being on LSD. And these distinct ways of being conscious are called global states. Okay. Now, a global state, it's a specific way of being conscious that consists of a natural grouping of domains of consciousness that don't vary greatly across instances in a global state and is distinct from other global states. So the idea is we have a domain like arousal, and it can be experienced in different ways. So low arousal, underlying anaesthetic, and high arousal on amphetamine. So we should be able to rate the domain on a scale, and that's what we've just done. We've taken 13 domains and we've rated them from 1 to 7. And the assumption is that when those domains change in some sort of predictable way, a creature is going to move from one global state to another. So these global states are distinct from each other in terms of how these relevant domains of consciousness are experienced. Okay, now this is something that philosophers do. I must admit my supervisor helped me with this. So I'm not very good at this sort of thing. But this is to answer this question, it helps to have a definition of what a global state is. So if you want to know if two subjects, X and Y, are in the same global state, or say two people, Sue and Bob, are in the same global state, I'll read the definition, then I'll explain it. Okay, so X is in the same global state as Y at time t at a given time, if and only if X and Y are in a subclass of all conscious subjects at that time, such that, and we have two conditions, every member of that subclass has a similar rating regarding A, B, C, and they're our relevant domains, like the 13 domains, and S is a natural class. Okay, that's technical, but what it means is we have all the conscious creatures at a given time. And if Sue and Bob are in the same global state, then they're in a subclass of all these conscious creatures. And Sue and Bob are going to have similar ratings regarding these relevant domains of consciousness. And we've said S is a natural class. We say that because we want to be able to make generalizations about members of that global state. And it also suggests that a global state is a natural kind. And I'm going to explain what that means in a minute. I'll come back to that in a discussion. Okay. So this is a wonderfully AI-generated image of what I imagine global states would look like. Now, global states don't float randomly in space. I'm losing my voice. They're going to be manifesting creatures who experience it. But the idea is that we have this kind of multi-dimensional space, and a global state is going to kind of somehow be situated in that, depending on how it's experienced. And sorry, the idea for this research question is to take one of these spheres, like the one at the front, and say that represents our sample of people who've experienced psychosis and their average scores for those domains of consciousness. And in this research question, we're questioning, do all those people who experience psychosis have similar scores for those domains? So, sorry I'm losing my voice. So we've said if Sue and Bob are in the same global state, they're going to have similar ratings for these various domains. So if psychosis is a global state and Sue and Bob are being psychotic, they're going to have similar ratings regarding these various domains. Okay, so that's what we're asking. But my survey doesn't really suggest that. I'm still working on my argument, and my interviews don't suggest that. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to report my survey results for this, and then I'm going to have a discussion section where I discuss what that could mean. And then I'm going to read a few more quotes from the interviews, and I'll revisit that definition of a global state and suggest some problems with it and some amendments we might make. Because I'm unsure in my argument if my results mean that psychosis is not a global state, or whether it means, we need to work on this definition of a global state. Okay, and as I said, this is a work in progress. So for the survey, your alternative hypothesis is going to be that these experiences of different experiences of psychosis aren't all going to have the same average scores for these domains. Okay. How are we going? Is this okay? Yep, okay. Good. I'm aware it's uni stuff, so you know. So this is image is produced by that software, the statistical software, using a procedure called hierarchical cluster analysis. And what this does, it takes our sample of 64 people and it divides them based on those average scores for those 13 domains. And what we have is 3 substantial clusters. So those vertical lines each lead to a cluster of participants. The participants are all along the bottom. Okay. This is another image. I'm not sure if this image actually works, but your outer sphere is your sample of 64, but that 64 actually contains 3 clusters within it. It could be that one of these clusters is outside that sphere. You know, I'm not sure how this works yet, but so what we do, we name those clusters based on the sort of scores that the participants got. So the participants in the normative cluster scored most closely to the normal waking state along the majority of those domains, 13 domains. The participants in the high arousal cluster scored highest for arousal, and the participants in the low function cluster scored lowest for memory, decision-making, behaviour. So lower than the normal waking state or 4 and lower than the other 2 clusters. And we can also ask how are these clusters different in terms of demographic information? So, you know, gender, age, education, etc., and diagnoses and beliefs. And I'm not going to discuss it in this talk, but the second part of my survey contained 20 questions from a questionnaire that asked people about the sort of beliefs or delusions they experienced during psychosis. So I have information which shows, you know, how those clusters are distinguished based on those beliefs. Okay. But look, this gives you an idea with diagnoses. So from left to right is the 4 most prevalent diagnoses in my sample. And they were schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, and depression. And this yellow column reflects the high arousal cluster. So the high arousal cluster is most prevalent in schizoaffective disorder and second in bipolar. And they're both mood disorders that involve mania. So you'd expect the high arousal cluster to score highly in those. The one on the right is depression, and it's scored lowest in depression, which you'd expect. And the one on the left is schizophrenia, which is high arousal scored lowest for that. So this, as I said, I haven't finished analysing all my data. I'm a bit overwhelmed. I don't know where to start with it. But this gives an idea of how you can look at this sort of data and see patterns in it. That's sort of the results I've got so far for this second research question, where we've got a sample and it's broken into 3 clusters. What I'm going to do now is, for the next 5 minutes or longer, I'm going to have a discussion about what this could all mean. And this is, again, I'm just saying this is philosophy that's a bit, just stop me at the end of it if you want to ask me about it. But what I'm doing is I'm taking this concept of a global state, and which is new in the science. It's not very old in the science of consciousness, this idea of a global state. And I'm saying this is a good concept. And the way I'm doing is that I'm using psychosis to say, you know, does psychosis kind of fit this? And to understand that, it helps to understand what natural kinds are and their relevance to this work. So a natural kind is when scientists go out into the world and they carve it up into categories of objects that exist in nature. So copper is a natural kind, and knowing that one instance of copper conducts electricity allows us to infer that others will. So natural kinds let us make inductive inferences and to understand scientific laws. There are different types of natural kinds, which I won't go into here, but there's essentialism and homeostatic property clusters. Anyway, I'm not discussing those, but natural kinds are relevant to psychiatry. So with psychiatry, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, which a lot of people know about, a lot of clinicians use the DSM to understand mental disorders. And the DSM is actually a system of classification that tries to understand mental disorders in terms of natural kinds. And this is relevant because if a mental disorder is a natural kind, it means we can generalize from one case to another, which means that treatment that works in one case will work in others. You're going to have to turn that sound off, whoever's talking on there, because I'm not that good.
No, they're all unmuted.
Oh, I can hear I can hear something, and I'm sorry about that. I don't mean to be so precious. I just can hear someone's. Okay. So, okay, so natural kinds are relevant in psychiatry. Okay. My work fits within a different theoretical framework to the DSM. So my work's not doing that. I'm looking at these domains of consciousness, seeing how they cluster together in experiences of psychosis and seeing what that can tell us. And this is, as I said, it's a phenomenological approach in that I take the first person experience of people who've been psychotic and I use that as my data. Okay. Now, natural kinds are meant to be mind independent. Okay, so we wouldn't think global states are natural kinds because they involve consciousness, and consciousness, you know, is to do with mental states. So you wouldn't think it's mind independent. But there's someone called Richard Samuels who's written a paper where he argues that delusions are natural kinds. And he says that they're mind independent because they exist, and again, delusions are like beliefs, so we wouldn't think they're mind independent. But he says they're mind independent because they exist independently of where we draw the boundaries to distinguish them. Okay, so using that sort of a framework, as I said, it's a work in progress, but we use that sort of a framework and we say, well, global states, understood that way, global states may be natural kinds. Okay. Now, I'm going to describe Samuel's argument for delusions a little bit because I want to see if it applies to my work. So with delusions, we have subclasses of delusions, like Capgras delusion, which is where someone believes someone close to them has been replaced by an imposter, or persecutory delusions. So we have these different types of delusions, and it seems that these different types of delusions are caused by different mechanisms in the brain, different neural mechanisms in the brain. And if we have these different sort of subtypes that have different causes, it looks like this overall class of delusions is not a natural kind. Because if it was, we'd expect this overall class to have the one cause, but we have these subclasses with different causes. Okay. Now, I hope that's clear. But what Samuel says, he says in science, we have these different levels of explanation. And we know this, we have quarks belong to the level of fundamental physics, whereas the idea of species belongs to biology, and then we have psychology. And so we have these different levels, and the brain is like that as well. So with the brain, we have this neurobiological level, the level of neurons, we explain things at that level. We also have a cognitive level. That's kind of like understanding the brain like a computer, where you have the kind of hardware and the software. And so what Samuel says, he says, while you have this category of delusions and you have these subclasses, this category of delusions, you can understand that on this kind of cognitive level, which is these are philosophical kind of terms, but computational functional level. And these subclasses that have different causes, you understand on this neurobiological level. Okay, I know this is a bit technical, but what I've got with my work, I'm saying I have this, we have global states, and then I have this sample of people with psychosis, and I'm saying, is it a global state and is it a natural kind? I have this sample, and then I have these three clusters. Now, I don't know, these three clusters have different neural mechanisms, but one argument is that you have these different experiences of psychosis, and they're sort of realized differently by different states and processes in the brain. But this overall experience of psychosis is understood on this more cognitive level. Now, another way to put that, Samuels talks about generic natural kinds and more specific ones. So if we think about all the metals are a generic kind, but magnesium is a more specific kind. And that's what we might find with psychiatric kinds, that we have these, psychosis as this generic kind, with these subclasses of psychosis as these more specific kinds. Okay, now thank you for bearing with me. I have a little bit more of this discussion, but I'm going to put it in a different framework that's probably a bit more straightforward. And I'm sorry about that. I hope that was okay. But the framework I'll put it in now, which is a little different, is that with global states, and this won't take long, they've been posited as this mid-level explanatory category. And a way to understand that is with the idea of species. So we have all the animals in the world, and then biologists come along and they posit this mid-level explanatory category where they try and cut up all those animals into groups or species, right? So species are arguably this kind of foundational building block of biology. But there's actually a huge amount of disagreement amongst biologists about how to understand species. And this is partly an empirical problem. We don't know, the number and boundaries of species, but it's also a conceptual problem where there are at least 24 different ways to define this term species. And that's like animals that have reproductive isolation, or that live in a distinct ecological niche, or that have morphological similarities. And these different definitions serve biologists with different aims. So this seems to be sort of what my work is showing with global states, is that, I'm getting this, overall sample that can be broken into these other things, and it's hard to know where to draw the boundaries and to cut up that space. And I've suggested using an argument like Samuel's, where we can, understand these different levels as different levels of explanation. But now, as I said, it's a work in progress, and I'm sorry, I'll stop there for a moment. That's my discussion section, so that's over. But was that okay? Oh, okay. Well, what I was saying is all delusions, as so the idea that you have all mammals, and part of mammals are dogs and cats, and yeah.
one delusion is Capgras delusion, where people believe someone's been replaced by an imposter. Another one is Courtard's delusion, where someone thinks they're dead. Another one is, I'm calling those the subclasses. So they are the subclasses. Yeah. No, I think it's just a distinction between saying that you have all delusions, but these subclasses can be caused by different parts of the brain. So, they can have different causes. So, oh, cool. Yeah. Okay. Is there anything else, or I mean that is the discussion for that, so that's okay. What I'll do now is move on to some more quotes. So with these quotes, I'm going to take a few of the domains that I measured and just read a couple of quotes and show how participants can have quite diverse experiences of those domains. So we said, if Sue and Bob are in the same global state, they're going to have similar ratings regarding these domains. But these quotes seem to show that, two people who experience psychosis can experience these domains in different ways. Okay. So the first one is arousal, and participant one seemed to experience low arousal. They said, I can sit for hours and stare. It really feels like my head is full of glue and all the cogs have ground to a very sticky halt. And I think that's probably what makes what I now recognise as a delusional thinking so much more vivid, because there's not a lot of other thinking going on. And this contrasts to participant 2, who said, I was definitely a bit more manic than I usually am, and I had a lot of problems with racing thoughts. So I'd think a lot about things, but my thinking was hindered. I'd be thinking about paranoia and the conspiracies more than normally. So I was probably heightenedly focused, but I'd be focused on really weird things like the birds having microtransmitters on them. Now, I'll read 3 quotes regarding time. Participant 5 said things sped up. They said, so there's stuff that you feel, think, see, hear, sense that other people don't. I have an awareness of that. I think it's an experience where things have sped up and you can't slow down, like a hyperdrive type of thing. Participant 6 said that time seemed to be endless. They said, and about my perception being heightened, definitely I was on full alert and perceiving it feels like time in seconds. It was endless. I was in the moment, and the moment never ended until I came out of psychosis. Participant 7 said time slowed down. They said, so things will slow down around the threat and you'll become hyper-focused on the threat, and things will drop away that are not essential to that threat. I would say hyper-vigilant on the threat. Certainly in the first episode, I was completely incapable of doing anything. I couldn't walk. I couldn't think. Now, the next one's the self. So participant 5 said they seemed quite childlike. They said, it's like a feeling that I can't keep up, like the inner world is bigger than the outside world. And I said, but you haven't changed. The sense of you as a person, you're still the same person. And they said, I am, but I'm probably younger. It's earlier life stuff, like their memories from the past. My husband said, when I'm in these states, it's really painful and awful, but I'm also very funny and childlike. Participant 6 seemed to lose their sense of self. They said, I didn't know who I was. I just knew that I didn't know where I was. I didn't know the time. I just always thought it was daylight because they were outside. I thought I was in the bush and I was just focused on escaping so they couldn't bury me alive. I knew I was me. I described myself to me as me, but I didn't know my name and I didn't know anything about me. So they're some of the domains that I measured. But I just want to point out in the interviews, experiences come up that weren't things that I measured, and these may be very important to understanding psychosis. So I just read two quotes where two different participants mentioned the experience of pressure. So participant 2 said, I was trying to get to the bottom of what was going on, and I was agitated and I was a bit paranoid and I was confused. It was like trying to find out what's going on and trying to process all that, because it was a lot of pressure thinking that everything's after you all the time, that whole time. It was a lot of stress. And participant 8 said, I experienced it as just overwhelming pressure, and it's the kind of pressure that just breaks you. It's just awful and unrelenting, and it's very hard to communicate it to anyone who hasn't experienced it, and I felt it across every area of my life. Okay. So what I'll do briefly now before I conclude is just revisit this definition of a global state. So, okay. So this A here, condition A, is that, you know, every member of this global state has a similar rating regarding ABC, or the various domains of consciousness. And that doesn't seem to be the case in the quotes, that people have the similar ratings. So first of all, a limitation with rating, we don't know what the relevant domains are. So I've taken these 13 domains out of the literature and tried to measure them, but we don't know what the relevant domains for global states are. And like the ones I've taken, some of them may not be very relevant, and there are definitely others that I haven't mentioned that would be relevant. So that's a limitation. But also, we can also ask which of these domains has the greatest explanatory power, and this has to do with the rating or the weighting of the domains. So we've taken these domains and we've measured them from 1 to 7. So say the normal waking state is 4, but in psychosis, arousal is 5.19, whereas complexity of contents is 5.11. That means arousal is going to be 0.08 weightier than complexity of contents when it comes to explaining why, you know, psychosis is different to the normal waking state. You know, so the idea is that some of these domains can be weightier than others when it comes to explaining why one global state is different to another. But other amendments to the definition, it could be that I think the interconnectedness of the domains is very important. So if you have a creature in one global state and arousal changes a lot and they change to another global state, how interconnected is that with the other domains changing? And I do have a table where I have my 3 clusters and I have the average scores for the 13 domains. And I don't know if I haven't done this yet, if I look closely there, if I'll be able to see any correlations or whatever. But even if I can't find it in my work, I think the interconnectedness is very important. And another thing, there could be additional conditions that we're not sure of, but I will mention here, I told you my work is based a lot on Tim Bain's work on global states. He did a lot of work on it, and I met him a few weeks ago, and spoke to him. And he mentioned with global states, there's this background feeling, and it's like a mood. So in depression, you have this worthlessness. And they talk about this prodromal mood as you move into schizophrenia, where you know, reality seems a bit weird or whatever. And he said this mood gets its tentacles into everything. And it seems really important that this mood that these states have, that's somehow built into the structure of experience. And I've taken these domains and very literally, you know, tried to measure these domains of experience. And I think that's quite a valid project, and there's not a lot of empirical work being done like that, so it's good. But I haven't factored in this background feeling, and that's another aspect. But regardless of that, we still have this condition that says if Sue and Bob are in the same global state, you know, they're going to have a similar rating regarding these dimensions, and that's not what my work shows. So I will wrap up. The next 3 slides, I'll talk about my conclusion and the significance of the work. So my work showed that during psychosis, 10 of these 13 domains are different to the normal waking state. And that's significant because we don't understand the causal mechanisms of illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder very well. So this is sort of a novel approach that takes the first-person experience and the science of consciousness. So it may have implications for research and treatment. But also, I've said recent work in this science of consciousness has suggested this multi-dimensional approach to consciousness in terms of global state. And while there's work being done to see how these domains contribute to global states, there's not a lot of empirical work being done, but it's important to understand consciousness, and it has clinical implications like understanding brain damage patients, understanding the treatment and experience of depression, and in my work, understanding psychosis. But I've also suggested that positing these global states as a mid-level explanatory category may be difficult, because I've had a result where I had a sample in these clusters. But I've suggested to use, you know, Samuel's argument where we have these different levels of explanations, like a cognitive level and a neurobiological level. Okay. But my last conclusion slide, you know, if psychosis was a distinct global state, it would seem that subjects who experience this would have similar ratings regarding these domains. And this doesn't seem to be the case in the surveys and interviews. So that makes it look like psychosis is not a distinct global state. But these findings may generalize to other experiences like REM dreaming and the normal waking state, in which case, you know, maybe global states aren't helpful in this emerging science of consciousness, or maybe we need to revise this definition. But it's probably a mixture of those things, because, you know, this work is going to be, you know, working on the concept and working on the empirical work as well. Okay, so I had a lot of help with the stats and beyond the stats as well. So I'd like to thank everyone on, you know, who's helped me, and thank you all for listening.
Very much, Shauna. Amazing. Come a long way. You've come a long way over the years. Yeah. We'd like to have a cup of tea now. Cups of teas in here, drinks, and then supper over here. We'll have about 10 minutes. Maybe even in case some silence didn't have done themselves.
Sorry, Jane.
Dennis, want to talk about for discussions, questions?
Sorry I sat down. I hope it was okay. I'll sit down again. Yeah. Any questions?
About arousal. It's such an academic word, arousal. I'm using it every day. Language. And if someone is given a great feeling, because their experience is one of the adversity, is that arousal, or is that your experience is fear? That's right, big time.
Yes, good morning, thanks.
Does that come under your ticket of arousal?
Thank you.
I'll answer this. There are going to be objective measures of arousal, like someone's heart rate. You know, that's like, I'm doing phenomenology, so I'm really doing how people experience it from the inside. So that's, you know, consciousness is a, you know, a subjective experience. And so I'm measuring people's experience. So presumably when they answer the survey, they're well, because we try and screen out people who are unwell. So they're kind of comparing them, they're comparing their current experience, unwell, with their memory of when they were psychotic.
The fear is the dominant aspect of the experience.
Yes, they're going to.
Yeah.
Presumably, if fear was the dominant aspect, then maybe they will report arousal as being very high from fear, but it could be high for other reasons.
Sure.
But again, you know, it's kind of this, I'm getting this felt, I'm getting how people, first of all, I'm relying on their memory of their experience, but most people seem to, like, we take memory as being a way of gaining knowledge, you know, so, you know, we assume that people can report on it, or if they don't, they won't, you know. But it's people reporting on their experience. So when you talk about fear, you know, that, or arousal, there are going to be objective measures. Is that a good answer?
Yeah, no, it's the answer. Yeah, that's right. It's just that fear is an experience we all have. I can identify with fear when I feel fear. Arousal, I think, oh, I don't know. You know, maybe my heart is beating faster when I'm fearful. But I'd still say my experience is of fear.
Okay, so are you asking are there other types of arousal?
No, I'm just thinking, does it come under your umbrella of arousal?
Yeah. Because I haven't measured for fear as a. Are you saying because I haven't just distinguished these sort of emotions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know you've got a limit.
How far
your framework,
do it?
yes.
But that's a really good point. Like when I'm measuring arousal and people's experience, are they reporting? You know, there are different types of arousal.
Yeah.
Fear is one of them, but there's sexual arousal. There's,
True.
you know, so yes. So what we're saying again with arousal, you've got mammals and you've got cats and dogs and mice, and you've got arousal and you've got fear, and you've got these subclasses. Yeah. So that's a really good point. Yeah, arousal.
I've got a question.
Thank you. Yeah.
Due to the statistical results you got, you seem to have She's not happy. All right. Anyway, so it seems that statistically, with the results there, you've come to see that possibly psychosis isn't a global state. That's sort of where you're at. But like the other instances you gave of global states was say for example, LSD. How much more statistically solid is the research around that to say, oh, this is definitely a global state, for example?
I will say this is a really newish area, and not a lot of work's been done. But again, talking to Tim Bain, he was saying like he wrote a paper on, psychosis, which I read, and it's like arguing that psychosis is not a higher state than the normal waking state because you measure along different dimensions, and whilst in not psychosis, LSD. So LSD, you'll have heightened perceptions, but your cognition will be worse. So unity or the self will be experienced differently. So when you're comparing these, you're saying one's not, LSD is not higher than the normal waking state. But someone wrote a paper responding to that saying, well, you can't say LSD because you have different dosages and you have set and setting. There are all of these factors that mean that you can't just kind of make this blanket statement when you say LSD is this state. And that seems, it could be that we have, like what I've found, you have these experiences with these clusters within them that are experienced slightly differently, or is that kind of what you're asking? Is that
Well, I just thought you'd established at the start that things like REM sleep, ordinary waking state, and LSD were definitely statistically solid enough to say, yeah, they're global states, but
it's not
you're not.
statistically solid. They're
Okay.
intuitively what we
Right.
global state.
Right.
So this is another thing Tim Bain has said to me. It is, we're positing this concept, okay, which we need to do empirical work to show how useful it is, but we work with our intuitions as well as our definitions. So to work out how useful this is going to be, like when I said these are our global states, that's what our intuitions tell us. But then you have to go and do this empirical work and play with your intuitions, play with your definitions, to kind of work out how this is new research, so we don't know how useful or his work into global states. The science of consciousness is new, so there's a lot of work that hasn't been done. So we haven't mapped all this out. And whether it can be mapped out, Andrew, I doubt. I'm doing this kind of, whether we can map it out, but we can have more complex and sophisticated understandings of consciousness when we do this sort of work.
So that's why you're a bit suspicious of the whole global state theory, I suppose.
Oh no, I love it.
Okay.
I think it seems really right that we have these different ways of being conscious. But as I've said, if my definition maybe the definition that I'm working with is wrong, but if these global states consist of these domains, then you'd assume that two people in the one global state are getting similar ratings. And if that's not happening, so, okay, there's something else that's accounting for why Sue and Bob are both on LSD.
Are there a lot more domains in the other, like say LSD, for example? Are there more domains or less domains than what you had in the research, or?
In LSD, are they more domains?
Yeah, were people that have researched that, have they put similar domains, more domains, less domains, or what?
even with what I'm doing, it's like how fine grained can you go? So
Yeah.
I'm doing, say, the quality of contents, but I'm not, when you say contents, they're perceptions or sensations or whatever. But it's kind of like you could ask those questions all of, you know, you could do it for each sense. How is taste experience? How is sight experience? How is sound experience? Like how fine grained do you go? And there's a paper where someone compares elephants to corvids, you know, birds to cephalopods like octopuses, right? And octopi, whatever. And you know, you're comparing these different animals, and you have like one animal has really good eyesight, one animal is really good at something else, and you know, so there, knowing how fine grained to go in terms of what should be measured. So mine, I took mine out of the literature that I read, my 13 domains, but you know, like I'm not really even beginning, I think, to touch on, you know, knowing, you know, do we break it down to senses? Do we break it down, like David said, you know, you have arousal, but that's broken down into, you know, these 5 major emotions, you know, and so yeah, it's this is just a small project that's very preliminary. I don't have a big sample, you know, I'm just starting, but I think this sort of research, there's a lot of room to explore this space that empirically, in terms of measuring this space, that work hasn't been done really.
Well, even the fact that the 4 you've got up there all have quite different results. You could break it down that way as well. Anyway, thank you. That was great.
Thanks, Andrew. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you did.
Just as an explanation, this is for the people who are on Zoom, so they can hear what questions being asked, because they hear the answer, but they don't know what question.
Fine. Just a very small question. Just, you know, in well, your work, the word psychosis and delusion. What's the difference?
Like, yeah. Well, psychosis is the official definition,
Right.
for psychosis. It's like a disconnection with reality, and it includes experiences that have things like hallucinations, delusions, disordered thoughts, and things like that. Okay, that's what psychosis is, a break with reality that can include delusions and things. Delusions have to do with false beliefs or unusual beliefs, often false beliefs, and often people won't give up those beliefs despite a lot of counter evidence. So it can be hard to understand why people hold these beliefs, but you know, and there are different types of delusions. Like there are what's called monothematic delusions, which is like this cat grass delusion, where you can have someone who's not psychotic, but they have this one. Monothematic means one thing. And so they'll have this one thing where, you know, they believe their spouse has been replaced by an imposter, and they're not actually kind of having a break with reality necessarily, but they, you know, they have this belief. And there are different theories about what causes that, like it's something to do with face recognition not being hooked up to emotion, so they don't get the normal affect when they see the person. And there are different 1-factor and 2-factor models to explain delusions, but there are also what's the name? Delusions that have got more than one thing. And for example, in psychosis, you know, there can be a lot about reality that's distorted. You know,
So,
a lot of beliefs.
yeah, I get that. So, I mean, is it needed something, a number or a quality or something of delusion in order to be you know, to be well officially diagnosed as psychosis?
Do you need a number of delusions?
Yes, number or you know, or different qualities or how.
I don't think that's how someone's assessed when, I mean, you know, David would know, you know, how is someone assessed when they turn up, when they yeah. Yeah. Intensity. Yeah. Yeah. So, but I think when someone turns up, presents at a hospital with psychosis, and I'm talking from my own experience, it's fairly clear when someone has a break with reality. You know, a clinician should be able to make that call if they're quite bad. But I guess there are cases where it's harder to make that call, you know, and people, but there are questionnaires. Yeah, putting. Yeah, well, I guess that's because these categories. I mean, you know, pardon. Exactly. I was going to say they're on a spectrum, you know, and we've made these categories. It doesn't mean that they are natural kinds. You know, these are kind of there are clusters of symptoms, you know, and a lot of these things are on a spectrum, and you know, so maybe the way the DSM has carved up these sort of disorders is, you know, may not, and I don't want to take a stand on it, but it may not be the most useful way of, you know. Pardon?
People see, for example, a pattern in a cloud. Thank you. You know that if you take enough data, there will always be some emergent clusters. Measuring whether that's just randomness, you know, or whether it is a meaningful cluster it's difficult. You know, I think statistically it's difficult as well as intuitively. Yeah. But now I've got the mic, you know, I wanted to ask, I thought it was very interesting. The two things were, you mentioned drugs a lot, you know, and I think everyone knows that you're in a kind of different consciousness on a variety of different substances. But linked into that people have, if they've never experienced, say, a psychotic event or episode, I think is the jargon, or if they've had no personal experience with an alternative state of consciousness, do you find that trying to explain this message is difficult for them, you know, if they've had a limited life experience?
I really like that you think I have a message and that I'm out there explaining it.
I think you touched on it just now. You said, you know, I think people intuitively know that it is a global state. I think I'm paraphrasing you, but I think that's probably, you know, seems like common sense that people who do have psychosis know that they're in a different state of consciousness. But of course, by definition, you know, the majority of people don't have that experience. So, you know, it's,
I guess, you know, being drunk, you
well,
know, and
a good point.
Dreaming.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think, oh, but you're asleep, you're not conscious. But in
you
REM dreaming, you've got contents of consciousness. So it's a conscious state. And I guess even, you know, when we're waking, if you wake up slowly or go off to sleep, you know, you're kind of drifting through this.
Well, there's also, you know, people talk about the meditation state, Buddhists and so on, where it's not, you're not asleep, you're not awake really. It's a different level of consciousness with different physiological, you know. Right, you know. Yeah. I suppose I'm sympathetic in that it would be very difficult to try and talk about a topic that probably most people who are reading your paper wouldn't have any clue of. You know, if they've never had a psychotic episode, they wouldn't have direct experience of what it's like.
Yeah, I don't give many talks, and the people I talk to know what I'm talking about.
That helps, right? Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking it would be very difficult to explain to people who've never personally experienced that.
Most people know drunk, light anaesthetic, I guess sleepwalk, honest. I can look, there's a whole, I mean, if I can find this slide that sorry, there,
yeah, exactly. There, yeah.
You know, kind of, they're really I said one dimension arousal, but
there are more
contents and level of wakefulness or arousal, and this, you know, there are more complex images that like this that include more states, but that kind of, you know, gives an idea of how clinicians think about these states, and where I can't include myself, arguing against this sort of model and saying, you know, it's more complex than that. There are more things involved that separate these different ways, but it's young work.
No, I'm inclined to agree. I think you're right. It probably is a different.
Pardon?
It probably is a different state, a separate state of consciousness. Yeah.
What is?
Psychosis.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, what I didn't say was,
right.
You know, with psychosis, and I meant to say this as part of my talk that I forgot. You know, we don't know the domains. When I revisited that definition, I said we don't know the domains, but that goes for psychosis. And I've said in psychosis, it includes delusions and disordered thoughts and hallucinations. And when you factor those delusions in, you know, I've talked about these kind of first-person experience of these aspects of consciousness, but when you factor these beliefs in as well to the experience, you know, that's one aspect that we're not factoring in. So whilst we don't know what domains are relevant for global states, you know, psychosis, we're also not factoring in the things that are really specific to the psychosis. You know,
I would guess that would be very hard for people to self-report. You know,
well,
I mean,
no, I've got that in I've got my second part of my survey is 20 belief questions.
Yeah.
And we've done the stats where we have 13 domains and 20 belief questions, and we've run 260 tests in both directions. And then so we have 260 light blue squares, and then amongst that we have dark blue squares that are the statistically significant ones. So say for one belief question, you have 8 domains are correlated with that.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
So, you know, but I haven't made sense of that. And
hard.
I haven't done, we have the results, but I haven't made sense of it. But that's the idea of saying, well, how are these domains associated with beliefs? That's the third research question. So you say, you have a belief about, you know, God chose me to do something special, I was on a mission or whatever, and that's correlated with 8 of these 13 domains. I don't know what that means, but we have the results. So, but that's, I guess, you know, seems to be part of trying to understand this as well, is seeing how those beliefs, you know, and those domains are related.
How they correlate. Yeah. Yeah. That's good. I think it's great.
Sorry about that.
Anyone else got a question? Well, I do. I'm just wondering, I mean, this is a crass question to ask, but I'm just thinking, you've done 64, so I'm respectful of the fact that you did hour-long interviews with people, so that gave you a lot of information about them. I'm wondering about the survey. Just in relation, you've done 64 surveys. How sure are you that that people are being consistent? What I'm thinking of is, and forgive me for saying this, but in psychological tests, there's an inbuilt lie scale, basically. If people are being inconsistent, then then the evidence that you have is inconsistent too. If that's how you're getting your evidence, and it's not consistent, then how sure are you of, or what is in the survey in order to find out whether or not there's an inconsistency? In all psychological tests, there is what's called a lie scale, and that's how you can tell whether or not the person is being inconsistent and whether or not the evidence is relevant.
I have to apply that to my work.
Yep, that was my question. Yep, thank you.
Pardon? Yeah. Yeah. Well, I tell you what we did do. We asked each of those domains. We asked 4 to 6 questions, and we asked them in different directions. And the questions were randomly generated. So people would ask. You'd ask 4 questions about arousal. 2 for greater, 2 for less arousal, but out of the 53 questions, they were randomly generated. So and as far as you said, the lie scale, that's yeah. Yeah, I did. I did have like the top stats consultant at ANU oversaw it all and helped me with the design of the survey.
Yeah.
But I would also say it may just be above my pay grade, Trish. I'm a PhD student, and this is a preliminary study and it's a project, but it's not. Yeah, it is what it is. It's a student's work.
And I'm respectful of that. And it was just a naive question, just to see whether or not that was there. Because of course, my background in terms of evidence and whatever. And I guess that was what came out.
No, it's a good question. My only answer is what I said, that we designed the survey with 4 questions, 4 to 6 questions, checking each domain randomly in 2 directions. So when you work out the average, you reverse 2 of them, and
yeah. Well, thank you for answering it. Yeah.
Oh, no, thanks for asking.
Yeah.
It's good.
Well, work at DTAT, we had a 360-degree survey, staff survey, where we have questions relating to our supervisor, our work colleagues, and people report to us. And it was things like, what does this person think of me, and what do I think of them, and what do I think about myself in relation to this, in relation to each direction. And it was all highly confidential, of course, except that it wasn't, because of the small size of teams, and the way people use words and so forth. So it was all quite extraordinary. So you've got this question of deception versus delusion, If you think I'm a great communicator, but then you'll see what people next to me think of whether I'm a great communicator or not, and on all hundreds of questions. And then highly priced consultants gave us a beautiful coloured report in a plastic binder, But the people's response to it was just so dreadful. It was supposed to be an annual exercise, but the response to it was so dreadful and traumatic that it was never done again. So this question of, so the question of of delusion, I think I'm a great worker, or a certain person across the pond thinks that he's a great peacemaker, What does everyone else think? Is a big problem in doing surveys, isn't it? Yeah.
I don't think my questions, I wasn't asking people to be self-aware in terms of their character, which is what I think you're describing. I was asking people to be introspective
Yes.
of their experience. And there is literature where people question introspection and challenge it. But it's also generally accepted that we can accept introspection as a type of evidence. So whilst I will note that in my discussion section about that there are people who question introspection, there are people like Daniel Dennett who I go into the argument, but there are people who say, introspection is not a good way of getting evidence because we don't know our own minds very well. But, for psychology, it's generally accepted as a mythology that people can report on their experience. So I just go from that basis that I'm taking introspection and phenomenology as my data, and I'm accepting that it's reliable for what I want to do with it. But that is a big debate, is this a reliable method? But
subjects why you so agree.
No. But that's what I'm saying. They were asked to introspect on aspects of their experience, like David said, arousal, which could have been anger or something else. But what I think Robert is talking about is people were asked to be self-aware about, their character or whatever, and how people perceive them, and that's kind of a more higher order reflection, I think, self-reflection. Yeah. So it's a self-conscious. No.
We actually came up with an idea about, there was one comment you read out some experience in an institution. My experience was possibly coloured by treatment, but they mentioned the space and the medication. But we were just discussing it, just that they didn't mention how they were treated by people, which is often really important. Well, in that one comment, but I was just thinking, not that particular example, but that maybe some is missed when we are afraid to maybe say, well, not one single nurse ever looked me in the eye and said, "How are you?" in 2 weeks, or something like that. So
I recall that interview.
Yeah.
And that person did comment on their treatment, which was not good at all. And I had several people, because I'm a mental health consumer, I have lived experience of psychosis. The people I interviewed, they didn't. I was a peer. I'm not a psychiatrist, and there were. It was a theme amongst a few people about being treated very badly in the system, and that participant had that experience. So I agree totally with what you're saying.
Oh no, I wasn't saying anything. I think I was just commenting that some bits might be missed. Yeah, and parts of the experience that are important to the topic of consciousness or where we're at. Like, I don't know what state we're in, because if the people around us make us feel isolated or that we're not awake or something, I don't know. I would think it would affect
so
us.
the interpersonal aspects
Yeah,
of our
might be as
experiences.
strong as medication. Like, let's say gaslighting is a known term, I think, in psychology. I mean, the whole experience could be disempowering to the point it's as strong as medication to make you disconnect with reality or whatever. Or what reality is it anyway in there or whatever? Yeah, I don't know. It's just a little question that came up. I'm not commenting.
No, it's totally cool. And if also what you're saying, which might be a broader part of it, is that, I've said the biomedical model will look at brain dysfunction and everything. There are systemic reasons why people don't flourish, poverty, too much medication, not enough support. There are all these reasons that are not to do with the illness. And there are people who argue, they don't label me because there are these systemic reasons. So for you to say something like, for example, a child grows up with parents with certain personality disorders, that child, as a result, has mental health issues, which, like you're saying, and I would just say I'm right on board with that. Okay. I think that's a really good point. If that did what I say fit in with what you were.
Yeah. I just was throwing it in, that one
Yeah.
idea. It was on the back of what someone said about capturing, what people, whether they were being real or genuine. I think that's what I was trying to answer to, about, like, you might not say some experience, some part of the experience, and only add other truths in it. I'm probably making less and less sense.
No. It's good. Thank you. It's good. We finished.
We finished up this.
Oh, there. Thank you, everyone, very much. Thanks.
Good on you for tackling such a complex area.
Okay, thank you, Shauna. You're doing a fantastic job tonight. It's been really great having you here and to share most of your personal journey. We've seen you over the years. I think you're really shining now. Doing a really fantastic job. And all the best for your ongoing work for the PhD. We'll book the MacKillop Centre for a postgraduate party for when you get through. Goodbye.
What a cake.
Yeah, I'll buy the biggest one I can find. There we are. Yeah, of course. And now tomorrow